Hey guys, welcome back. This week's topic is going to be hemispheres. We just got done talking about general, sort of basic neuroscience, and now we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the left and right hemispheres. So let's start with talking about lateralization and localization. These are all the topics that we'll cover, and that includes decusation and split brain patients, but in this video we'll just be talking about lateralization and localization. So when we say lateralization, what do we mean? If you think about longitude and latitude, right? Longitude is going up and down on a map, latitude is going side to side, and that's really what we mean with lateralization. That functions are essentially assigned to either the left or right hemisphere. And we've all heard of this left-right dichotomy. Pop culture kind of ran away with this one. We think about the left brain as being logical and calculating and linguistic. This is the side of your brain that helps you do math. And we think about the right side of the brain as being emotional and holistic and intuitive. And this is the side of your brain that helps you paint pictures and play the violin and write love poems. So it's pervaded in pop culture, but the fact is that most of the things that we are able to do are done in both hemispheres. Why is that? And evolutionarily speaking, there's a good reason for it, and that reason is redundancy. The more your brain can take over when things are damaged, the better off you are as far as being able to function in your environment. So why does this myth prevail if it's not exactly the truth? Well, there is some evidence that may have contributed to this fad. So when we get stroke patients with damage to the left hemisphere, for example, these patients, obviously because there's damage in the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere is going to take over some of the work. And we see these patients become more pessimistic, sometimes overly emotional, and overly noticing of non-serious problems. And you get the opposite when you get stroke in the right hemisphere. Sometimes these patients become more optimistic. They become unemotional. They become oblivious to serious injury and disability. Okay, so there is a bit of evidence that may have contributed to this popular view of the hemispheres. And here's actually a little bit more. So there are some major functions that are they are localized in one hemisphere or another, but that is not to say that the other hemisphere can't take over when necessary. So some of these functions would be in the left hemisphere. We've mentioned things like language being in the left hemisphere, right? So you've got, let's get a pen here. You've got Broca's area up here and Wernicke's area back here in temporal lobe dealing with language, but we've seen time and time again people with stroke that have uptake of function in the right hemisphere in the equivalent areas, right? Now we also know that there's that your hemispheres function contralaterally, meaning that the left hemisphere is going to be taking care of the right side of your body and the right visual field, and the right hemisphere is going to be taking care of the left side of your body and the left visual field. And we also know that things like faces and certain visual motor tasks are taken care of generally in the right hemisphere. So, enough about lateralization. Let's talk about localization. Now, what is the difference? When we say lateralization, we talk about assignment between hemispheres, and when we talk about localization, we're talking about actual specific areas wherein function is localized. Okay, localized is when a contiguous area really sort of controls the task at hand. So we do have some evidence. A lot of this evidence comes from rats. So selective memory loss, right? So when certain frontal areas are inhibited, rats aren't able to filter out irrelevant information. We have things like aperceptive agnosia. This is a disorder wherein your vision remains intact, but you have impaired recognition of shapes and forms. Now, this is very closely associated with associative agnosia, but they are different. Okay, here your vision remains intact, shapes and forms remain intact, but you have impaired object recognition. Okay, so the level of the agnosia is different between the apperceptive and the associative. Apperceptive being at the level of perception, and associative being at the level of semantic association. So let's have a little look at the difference between apperceptive and associative. So in apperceptive agnosia, the patient doesn't create the correct percept on their own. So you can see by these drawings, these on the left are what the patient was supposed to be drawing, and these on the right are what the patient actually produced of the drawings. Nonverbal, tactile, and motion cues can facilitate recognition. So it's just the visual perception that's damaged, right? So if you show them a watch, they are not going to be able to recognize that object. There is something about object perception that is impaired in apperceptive agnosia. Okay, if you hand them the watch, if you give them that tactile information to sort of assist the incoming visual information, then they can get it. They also recognize real-world objects better. Why would that be? Take a moment to think about it. Probably because we deal with real-world objects all the time. So we have a lot more interaction with real-world objects than we do with, say, images on TV, things we've never, seen before, mountains, those kinds of things, right? You're interacting with your computer, you interact with your coffee cup, you interact with a pencil. These things, you have nonverbal, verbal, visual, tactile, all kinds of different perceptual experiences with these kinds of objects. And that's why it's a little bit easier for patients with this disability to recognize these kinds of objects. Usually in the case of apperceptive agnosia, there is diffuse brain damage. So let's look at a little bit of a video demo.
What is this I'm holding up in front of you now, Caroline?
He's holding up a watch for her, and Caroline is looking at this watch, and she's not able to recognize what it is.
Piece of jewelry or watch or something, but I can't distinguish which one it may be.
Would you take it in your hand? Just take it in your hand.
So notice that perceptually she can't locate the object, so visual spatial skills are impaired.
It's your tie.
You having trouble finding it?
I found the tie.
You found...
Your tie.
You found my tie. She says she found my tie, but what is it I'm moving in my hand? I'll get it in the right field here so that she can be sure to see it. Do you see something moving now?
Yes. I don't know what it is. It looks like a round circle.
Looks like a round circle. Take it in your hand.
Something that's connected to this, whatever it may be.
It has hold of my wire here. Caroline, I'm going to put it in your hand and you tell me what it is. What is it now?
A watch?
So, is it a watch? Is it? Just feel of it some more.
What's my glasses?
Good for you. What is that I'm holding
Okay,
up
so
in
it was
front of you?
actually her glasses. I was mistaken on that one. But you can see that it's not until she gets those tactile cues that she's really able to focus in on the features of the object and put them together perceptually in order to recognize the object. Now let's take a look at associative agnosia and the differences there. Here we get the correct percept. Okay, so you give them these pictures, they're able to pretty nicely copy these pictures. Right? It's the deeper association with the label that's severed. So they would be able to draw this picture of the ring, but they wouldn't be able to tell you that it's a ring. They don't get any nonverbal recognition or motion facilitation. And in this case, there are lesions that are generally bilateral. So you don't have any sort of reuptake of function going on by one hemisphere or another because the lesions are bilateral, meaning both sides, right? And the scope of this deficit, it really varies. So these patients, they can tell you what a thing is if you ask them. So like if you ask them like what's a kangaroo, they know what a kangaroo is, right? They can tell you what a kangaroo is. But if you show them a picture of a kangaroo, they can't recognize the kangaroo. So it's the connection between the visual percept and the semantic label that is severed. So let's have a look at this demo.
Name a few things.
Okay.
What is that?
Apple.
Okay, good. And what is that?
Candle.
Good.
Crayon type stuff, you know.
Okay, which is it?
Crayon. Because that smells better.
Is this a crayon or a
That's
candle?
a crayon shaped like a candle. Really?
Well, if it's shaped like a candle, why wouldn't it be a candle?
Because it smells like a crayon.
Oh, I didn't notice you smell. What is that?
It's a pipe.
Okay, good.
Okay. Now let's skip to...
Not a
Okay.
telephone.
I'm really at a loss. I can't. It just isn't making any sense at all now.
Is it bigger than a cat or smaller than a cat?
And a cat?
So what the patient is trying to do now is actually, he's trying to identify a combination lock. Okay, he previously identified this object as a telephone. Why would a combination lock look like a telephone? This was back in the rotary age of telephones, way before your time. Just on the brink of my time, actually. So it would have been easy, well, it would have been understandable how one would be mistaken for the other. So notice how he did okay with the first few objects in that first skit. But there are some, not skit, in the first scene, right? But there are some objects that he just, the label to the percept is severed. So let's check this out.
Well, it's probably smaller than the cat.
About what size is it?
Oh, it's about that long.
Mm-hmm. About what
that
size
wide.
is it? Telephone. Just
About yay by yay.
so this is smaller than a telephone?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Does it have anything to do with communication?
Yeah, because this is the numbers you gotta hook up with them in order to dial your number or something, you know.
And why do you dial the number?
Because that's evidently what that dial is for. I don't know. Yeah.
Let me give you a hint.
Okay.
I'm going to give you a choice, and you tell me what this is.
Okay, I can tell you then.
Okay. Is this a clock, a lock, or a telephone?
A lock.
Is it a lock?
A clock, a lock, or a telephone? Okay, let's rule out a telephone. What? A clock or a lock? Clock. That'd be a lock. Must be a lock then.
Are you sure?
No, I'm not. But I don't recognize it as a telephone.
Okay, so notice that even when he's given the semantic label for the object, he can't make the connection between the two. So he's trying to reason out what the object must be, right? Well, those are the numbers, so that must be, yes, this must be involved with communication because that's what I'm, that's like a telephone, and I would use those numbers to link with. And then she gives him the options, and he's still, with the label right there in front of him, can't put it together with the object. Okay, so that's really the severity of these kinds of deficits. Okay. Excuse me. So some other evidence that we have, things like dyscalculia. Can't do simple calculations. Alexia, you can't read. Agraphia, you can't write. These kinds of deficits all occur when specific damage is done to specific areas of the brain. Okay, we have things like Broca's aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia, where we've talked about Broca's area. This is where you produce language. If you have damage to Broca's area, you get Broca's aphasia. You can't produce language. You get damage to Wernicke's area, you get Wernicke's aphasia, where you can't comprehend language. Wernicke's aphasia is definitely worse, in case you're wondering, because if you can't comprehend language, you also cannot produce it. Okay. Now let's be critical. We've talked about all these disorders. We've defined localization as sort of necessitating a contiguous area, right? But if you think about the Broca-Wernicke scenario, and you think back to what we saw in our discussion on things like PET, those kinds of imaging techniques, producing language really takes a multitude of areas. These areas are all interconnected. So until we know all of the forward connections and all of the feedback connections, we don't really know exactly where things are localized. Like, how localized is localized? Do we want to say that language production is really localized to Broca's area? Do we want to say that comprehension is really localized to Wernicke's area? Do we really want to say that, face selective occipital cortex is really, that's it, that's the only area that is responsible for face perception? Well, we do know that when we damage that area, we get things like prosopagnosia, right? You can't recognize faces. You can see all the features of a face. You can say that, oh, this person has blue eyes and brown hair, but I don't recognize their combination of features, right? But does that really mean that these things are localized? Or are these just the assumptions that we can make based on the current level of knowledge that we have about how the brain functions? Just a philosophical question. Sit with it, simmer in it a little bit, use it for your interaction if you want. Something to think about. Okay. Apparently I had animations to go with that whole explanation and I didn't use them, so here they are now. Okay, so that was our little discussion on lateralization and localization. Next, we will talk about decusation, and in case you're wondering what that means, you'll have to tune into the next video. I'll see you guys there.